Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here on what's still probably a gorgeous day outside. Some things are very, very easy to do, and introducing Richard Dawkins is one of them, because you're all here because you know who he is, or you've got friends who know who he is and they've told you. So there's very little I have to say. Honorary degrees, lots. Prizes, many. Fellow of the Royal Society, founding professor of the Public Understanding of Science in Oxford. That's a very singular one. But also someone I've known for, I'm guessing, just over 50 years. He and I moved into what we thought of as a kind of, well, I thought of, as a kind of space-age lab. The psychology department and the zoology department were co-housed in a prize-winning building, second prize of the year from the Concrete Society. I believe the first prize went to the new runway at Heathrow, but I'm not quite sure. Psychologists and zoologists have real overlapping interests. Richard, when I first knew him, was working in the animal behavior group. I was working in animal experimental psychology. I messed around with them, and he watched them to see what they would do when they were left to themselves. I was never able to leave them to themselves. But I suppose that the particular reason that you'll be here today is because of Richard's quite extraordinary series of books on science. He, I think it would be fair to say, founded the genre of popular science that we have today. And what I think is truly remarkable about the way he did it and continues to do it is he makes it accessible without oversimplifying it. Beautiful prose, but truthful all the way down to the foundations. That's an extraordinary achievement. And I think without Richard having done that, we wouldn't have had a brief history of time, very probably, and the world would have been an easier place. I asked Richard if he happened to know how many copies his first book, The Selfish Gene, had sold, and he thought it was about 3 million in English. How many languages? 30 plus. I thought we would start by reading a brief piece, not actually from The Selfish Gene, but from The Blind Watchmaker. And Richard might tell you a little bit about why it's called that and what it's about, but it illustrates to me exactly what The Selfish Gene had told us. So,
The Blind Watchmaker is natural selection, because natural selection is blind. It doesn't have foresight. It doesn't know where it's going. The watchmaker comes from William Paley, an 18th century theologian who wrote a book on natural theology in which he imagined that you stumbled across a watch and you looked at the watch and you realized it must have had a watchmaker. And how much more, he thought, if you stumbled across a living thing, an organ of a living thing, an eye, for example, must it have had a divine designer. So he popularized the watchmaker as a metaphor for God. And I adopted the blind watchmaker to refer to natural selection. I should apologize to begin with. I'm going to do so in verse. Please forgive me if I croak. It's because I had a stroke. Basal ganglion on the right makes me walk as if I'm tight. So if I sink to groans, I'm pleading, Lalla, will you do the reading? I'm going to do a reading now from The Blind Watchmaker, which I think summarizes the message of The Selfish Gene. It is raining DNA outside. On the bank of the Oxford Canal, at the bottom of my garden, is a large willow tree, and it is pumping downy seeds into the air. There is no consistent air movement, and the seeds are drifting outwards in all directions from the tree. Up and down the canal, as far as my binoculars can reach, the water is white with floating cottony flecks, and we can be sure that they have carpeted the ground to much the same radius in other directions too. The cotton wool is mostly made of cellulose, and it dwarfs the tiny capsule that contains the DNA, the genetic information. The DNA content must be a small proportion of the total, so why did I say that it was raining DNA rather than cellulose? The answer is that it is the DNA that matters. The cellulose fluff, although more bulky, is just a parachute to be discarded. The whole performance, cotton wool, catkins, tree and all, is in aid of one thing and one thing only, the spreading of DNA around the countryside. Not just any DNA, but DNA whose coded characters spell out specific instructions for building willow trees that will shed a new generation of downy seeds. Those fluffy specks are literally spreading instructions for making themselves. They are there because their ancestors succeeded in doing the same. It's raining instructions out there. It's raining programs. It's raining tree-growing, fluff-spreading algorithms. That is not a metaphor. It is the plain truth. It couldn't be any plainer if it were raining floppy disks. Floppy disks dates it a bit. Nowadays, you'd have to say it was raining data from the internet or something like that, but that doesn't have the same ring to it.
So that piece really does describe, I think in beautiful terms, what the selfish gene itself, the original book, was telling us. But I think my first question to Richard was, when the selfish gene came out, it really appeared as a surprise. Why were people surprised by something whose logic is so clear?
Right. Well, Darwin thought of the individual organism as the level at which natural selection acts. He saw it as being a choice between individual organisms, but he recognized, of course, that it wasn't just a matter of the individual surviving. It also had to reproduce. That was the point. It was reproductive success that mattered, and hence his theory of sexual selection, where animals are chosen by members of the opposite sex for their capacity to attract members of the opposite sex. So Darwin saw natural selection as choosing between individual organisms for their capacity to survive and reproduce. But if you think about it, survival and reproduction, what is it that actually survives? What is it that actually goes on from generation to generation? It's certainly not the individual. We all die. The only thing that goes on to the next generation, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next, is the gene, or genes. So you can think of natural selection as working at the level of the genes themselves. As the generations go by through geological time, what happens is that some genes survive and some genes don't survive. What we see today are organisms, animals and plants, admittedly, but what we see are genes that have made it through countless generations. So natural selection is this differential survival of genes through generations. And the method by which they survive is by manipulating the development of individual bodies via the process of embryonic development. So genes survive or don't survive. The unsuccessful ones don't survive. The successful ones do survive. And the way they ensure their survival is by manipulating the embryology of organisms so that those organisms are good at surviving and good at reproducing, good at parental care, good at everything required to pass on those genes. So I see, and this was the phrase I developed in The Selfish Gene, the individual organism is a survival machine for the genes that ride inside it. It's a great big robot that has been built by genes that have survived through countless generations for their capacity to build robots just like this one.
I can't help thinking when you say that, Richard, of a story I heard of your being interviewed by, I think, a Japanese television crew who insisted on doing all the interviewing in a black London taxi, driving around Oxford unaware of which roads it could go up and which it didn't. Would you just briefly explain why that happened?
A Japanese television crew came in a London taxi, and they completely filled the taxi with all their camera gear and everything. And I was told that I had to be interviewed in the taxi. And it turned out there wasn't room for the interviewer in the taxi, as well as the cameraman. So I had to improvise, and I had to sort of talk to the camera, much as I've just been talking to you now. And I also had to direct the driver, because he was a London taxi driver. He didn't know his way around Oxford. And the Japanese film director wanted it to go through scenic routes. As I had to say, turn left here, and then I'd expound a bit more about the selfish gene, turn right here. Anyway, I then got back to the room, and I asked the director, well, that was all right, but why the taxi? And he said, oh, isn't your theory the taxi cab theory of evolution? And it must be that the Japanese translation of my idea of the survival machine for genes, it must have been translated as the taxi cab for genes. But I was bewildered by this reference to the taxi cab theory of evolution at the time.
Well, it's nice to know that one comes up with truly original thoughts, yes, even when one doesn't know it.
Yes.
I have no idea how the Cantonese version of the selfish gene translates a vehicle of this kind, but maybe it's the same. Richard, given that the logic of the selfish gene, that what is being selected for is, if you like, the unit of inheritance, whatever that may be, clearly we've seen people then trying to extend this, do you think it's as a metaphor? I'm not sure, to memes, so that selection of particular behaviors or thoughts could be regarded as just another example of the same kind of process. And I think I'm right in saying you coined the term meme, though you may be fed up with it now and again.
That's right. At the end of The Selfish Gene, the whole book having been devoted to the gene as the unit of selection, because it is a replicator. It makes copies of itself. And I thought, well, I didn't want to leave readers with the impression that that was the only possible replicator that could serve as a unit of Darwinian selection. And I thought, well, one could imagine on another planet, if there's life on other planets, then there would have to be some equivalent of DNA to act as the unit of selection. But perhaps we don't have to go to other planets. We can look right here at the meme, which I coined as the unit of cultural selection. So anything that is replicated is potentially a unit of natural selection. And in a human society, there are things that are replicated through a culture. There are things like clothes fashions. There are things like hairstyle fashions, things like catchy tunes that people whistle. The very word catchy suggests that it is catching like a virus. And I coined the phrase virus of the mind at the same time. So the meme was the cultural equivalent of the gene. I don't really know whether it's the science of memetics, as it's been called, has actually come up with anything very fruitful in the way of Darwinian analysis. But potentially it's there. Potentially it could become a unit of selection, a unit of a form of Darwinian selection. But that's all I want to say about memes. I'm getting a bit fed up with them, really.
Right. You notice I approached it slightly tangentially, and I hope tactfully, so as not to stick with it too long. I also thought it might be interesting just to get your view on the way in which, as people have started thinking of, if you like, the units of evolution, the ways in which they've started using that information in design. And I know that there's an example.
Oh, yes. There have been attempts by engineers to design in a Darwinian way. And in some sense, you could say that all engineers are designing in a Darwinian way when they have ideas which they then discard or keep. But one engineer that I know, a German engineer called Rechenberg, actually did it more explicitly. For example, he designed windmills the precise shape of the blade of a windmill to be optimal in getting the most energy out of the wind. And he did this by constructing the blade of a windmill out of little veins of metal which were stuck together, and the angle of each vein next to the next one was determined by what he called a gene. So this would just be a number, and this number would be the angle that each of these little strips of metal was held at, stuck next to the next one. And so the blade of the windmill could be a rather strange higgledy-piggledy shape of strips of metal glued together. And he would then put the blade in a wind tunnel and test how good it was. And then he would breed from it if it was successful. Breed from it would mean make a new one using the same genes. But the genes were allowed to mutate in a Darwinian sense, in a genetic sense. They were allowed to change slightly. And he could then breed which windmills were most successful in the wind tunnel. And after many generations, he ended up with an optimal windmill. He did the same thing with the injection nozzle for diesel engines, oddly enough. So he would make the nozzle out of bits of metal with holes in, and again the genes would determine the size of the holes in the nozzle, and again breed from the most successful ones in actually putting into a real diesel engine and seeing how successfully it worked. And what was rather remarkable, he claimed that if he started from a different random point, it would converge on the same optimal diesel injection system from different starting points.
That's a very good moment, thinking of convergent evolution from different starting points, to consider reading our second piece, which is an illustration of exactly that kind of thing. And perhaps we can then extend the discussion after that to slightly different domains.
This is also from the Blind Watchmaker, and it's about convergence between two kinds of ants which form great armies that march through the jungle, and they don't have any fixed abode. They're constantly on the move, like a traveling army. These are driver ants in Africa and army ants in South America and Panama and Central America. And I was brought up as a child in Africa, and I was frightened of driver ants. I was terrified of them. I'd heard stories about how they would march through whole villages and devour everything, kill everything that they found in the villages, and I was very frightened of them. And this is what I wrote in the Blind Watchmaker, much later, of course. As an adult in Panama, I have stepped aside and contemplated the new world equivalent of the driver ants that I had feared as a child in Africa, flowing by me like a crackling river, and I can testify to the strangeness and wonder. Hour after hour the legions marched past, walking as much over each other's bodies as over the ground, while I waited for the queen. Finally she came, and hers was an awe-inspiring presence. It was impossible to see her body. She appeared only as a moving wave of worker frenzy, a boiling peristaltic ball of ants with linked arms. She was somewhere in the middle of the seething ball of workers, while all around it the massed ranks of soldiers faced threateningly outwards with jaws agape, every one prepared to kill and die in defense of the queen. Forgive my curiosity to see her. I prodded the ball of workers with a long stick in a vain attempt to flush out the queen. Instantly, 20 soldiers buried their massively muscled pincers in my stick, possibly never to let go, while dozens more swarmed up the stick, causing me to let go with alacrity. I never did glimpse the queen, but somewhere inside that boiling ball she was, the central data bank, the repository of the master DNA of the whole colony. Those gaping soldiers were prepared to die for the queen, not because they loved their mother, not because they'd been drilled in the ideals of patriotism, but simply because their brains and their jaws were built by genes stamped from the master die carried in the queen herself. They behaved like brave soldiers because they'd inherited the genes of a long line of ancestral queens whose lives and whose genes had been saved by soldiers as brave as themselves. My soldiers had inherited the same genes from the present queen as those old soldiers had inherited from the ancestral queens. My soldiers were guarding the master copies of the very instructions that made them do the guarding. They were guarding the wisdom of their ancestors, the Ark of the Covenant. I felt the strangeness then and the wonder, not unmixed with revivals of half-forgotten fears, but transfigured and enhanced by a mature understanding which I'd lacked as a child in Africa of what the whole performance was for. Enhanced too by the knowledge that this story of the legions had reached the same evolutionary culmination not once but twice. These were not the driver ants of my childhood nightmares, however similar they might be, but remote New World cousins. They were doing the same thing as the driver ants, and for the same reasons. It was night now, and I turned for home, an awe-struck child again, but joyful in the new world of understanding that had supplanted the dark African fears.
So that explains for us something about why it is that the social insects have what in other respects would seem an almost incomprehensible life. I wonder if you could say a little more about how the understanding of what's really going on, that, if you like, the payoff matrix for the individuals in those colonies. How did we come to understand that?
Well, my somewhat high-flown language about the Ark of the Covenant and the wisdom of their ancestors and things, that's all about the social insects being the queens, the lineage of queens down generations is the repository for the genes going down through the generations. The workers are sterile. They don't reproduce. But they contain the genes which are copies of the genes in the queen. So what they're in effect doing is guarding, protecting, fighting for copies of the same genes in the body of the queen and of the other young queens. So in a sense, you could think of the worker bodies as being similar to the cells in our own body, where the reproductive cells in our gonads, in our ovaries and testes, are equivalent to the queen, and our hands and our feet and our kidneys and our livers and so on are equivalent to the workers. They don't pass on their genes to the future. It's only the genes in our gonads that do. Similarly, in an ant colony, it's only the genes in the queen that actually do, and the males, that actually do get passed on to future generations. But the workers contain copies of the same genes. And so a copy of a gene in a worker that causes the muscles and the brain of the worker to work for the queen, to guard her, in the case of soldiers, they have these huge great jaws that they attack any enemies with. They are guarding the queen because genes in them are carried in the body of the queen. Copies of the genes are carried in bodies of the queen. Now, what the whole enterprise is aimed at is towards the certain time of the year, in Britain it would be towards the end of summer, or midsummer, suddenly out of the ground would boil great quantities of winged young queens and males. They have wings unlike worker ants, and they fly up in the air, mate, preferably with members of other colonies, and then the young queens fly off to a distant place, land on the ground, dig a hole, bite off their wings because they don't need them anymore, or pull them off, dig a hole, and start a new nest. The first few eggs that they lay will develop into workers, which then help her, and then gradually the colony develops, becomes bigger and bigger, more and more workers, which gather food to feed the young, and eventually they start making more young queens and males, and the whole cycle repeats. So the whole enterprise is based upon the presumption that it's going to be the genes are going to be carried out of the colony in the winged bodies of young queens and males. But all the workers are doing is working to that end. They're protecting the queen, they're protecting the colony, they're feeding the larvae, gathering food, doing all the things that are necessary to make sure that there's a successful exodus from the colony as the young queens and males fly out on their wings and start the cycle again. The same thing happens with termites, who have quite independently evolved the same habit, completely different. They're not related at all. And as I said, this particular habit of wandering armies has evolved twice in driver ants and army ants. But the social insects are a beautiful illustration of the principle of the selfish gene, precisely because it is sterile individuals who are working for copies of the same genes in the bodies of queens and males. They're not reproducing themselves. It's the genes that matter, not the reproductive success of the individuals doing the behaving, who are the sterile workers.
So that leads me to think of two ways in which we could extend this line of thought. One would be to think about other species that exhibit very much that sort of behavior, to have a queen and a bunch of workers who have no reproductive rights of their own. That's one. And I think then taking that somewhat further still, it's interesting to start thinking about the way in which the well-being of one's closest relatives, in some respects, are well-being for oneself as well, in the sense that the genes in your nearest relatives are potentially...
Yes, so the social insects are a special case because the workers are sterile, but the same principle applies to lots and lots of animals, where animals will take care of their kin, take care of their, not just their own offspring, which is is obvious since Darwin's time, but also their siblings, their brothers and sisters, their nephews and nieces, their grandchildren, their great-nephews, and so on. And a lot of what we can understand about animal behavior, animals that work together, that cooperate, that work for the benefit of other animals, can be interpreted because they share genes. So a gene that makes an individual gives some food to a relative. That gene is ensuring the copies of itself in the body of the relative, in the reproductive success of the relative. So taking care of siblings, taking care of brothers and sisters, you see all over. Many birds do it, many mammals do it, but the social insects, the ants, bees, wasps, and termites, show it to an extreme extent.
And I have to ask you about naked mole rats. I mean,
okay.
no day is complete without being asked about naked mole rats, and I don't want an incomplete day for you.
Naked mole rats are mammals which behave rather like social insects. They live in Africa. They burrow underground. They almost never are seen above ground. They live in huge colonies. They are naked. They have no hair. They're spectacularly ugly, by human standards at least. I imagine they quite like each other. They have one female who's called the queen, who is almost the only female who reproduces. There's a certain amount of reproduction in other females, but not much. So you can call her the queen, and you can call the others workers because they help the reproductive success of the queen. The queen has far, far more offspring than any other mammal, than any mammal normally would. I forget the exact numbers, but it's huge numbers. Like a queen ant or a queen termite. I mean, a queen termite, you've probably seen pictures of them, huge, great bags of eggs. They can't move. They're just horrible, great big white bags of eggs. Well, a queen naked mole rat isn't quite like that, and she's the kind of nearest mammal equivalent to a termite. These colonies become extremely large. They dig burrows underground which extend for huge distances underground. And as I say, they never come up. There's something a bit wrong with that, I can't help feeling, because I remember I told you that in the case of ants and termites, the whole enterprise is aimed towards this end product of winged reproductives bubbling out, boiling up out of the ground, and then flying off, carrying the genes elsewhere. And it looks as though the naked mole rats don't do that, and they ought to do that. Something has gone wrong there. They don't fulfill the full analogy to the social insects. And I was rather upset about this, and I predicted, I now predicted, my prediction hasn't yet come true, but it will. I predict...
You all heard it. You've
yes,
all heard this. This is a definite prediction.
I predict that one day somebody will discover a dispersal phase of the naked mole rat. They don't. My prediction is they don't just stay underground the way they're supposed to. My prediction is that this, for some reason, we're not seeing them, but there must be a dispersal phase. I'm not suggesting they literally have wings, like winged ants.
I did like the notion of naked mole bats.
Yes. Actually, the only reason why there aren't winged rodents is that bats have got there already, I suspect. So my prediction is this. Maybe it'll turn out that there's some other species of mole rat. There are other species of mole rat which are not naked. They're hairy mole rats. Maybe one of these species of hairy mole rat will turn out to be the dispersal phase of the naked mole rat. And that's a testable prediction because the genome of the naked mole rat has been sequenced. So all we need to do is capture some hairy mole rats and sequence their genome, and I predict that one of them will turn out to have the same genome. Or another possibility is that it could be a bit like locusts. You know that locusts are really just grasshoppers who, under some circumstances, change into locusts. They look different, they behave differently, they form into huge swarms that spread all over the countryside. And in America, for example, there are grasshoppers which are known to have turned into swarming locusts in the 19th century, but have not done so since. For some reason, the conditions haven't been right for these American grasshoppers to turn into locusts. Well, what if naked mole rats are a bit like that? What if the conditions for turning into the dispersal phase of the naked mole rat have never quite been met? And maybe one day we'll suddenly see mole rats boiling out of the ground and swarming all over the countryside. So that's the alternative version of my rather daring prediction.
I love the prediction. I'm not sure whether I do or don't want to be there when it happens.
Yes.
There's something about being boiled, having your feet boiled over by naked mole rats that is, well, about which one might have ambivalent views.
They are very ugly indeed.
They are very ugly. So those are sort of thinking about the ways in which altruism, perhaps we might just touch on one other thing too, which is something you and I talked about earlier today, which is competition. So who are your competitors for survival? And in some respects, the harshest competition must come from those who are trying to occupy exactly the same niche, want to eat the same things, want to do the same things, want to claim the same sorts of mates. In other words, in some respects, you might think that the greatest competition would be those closest to you. And yet, as we've heard, we also look after those with whom we have kin relationships. So there's a sort of a balance, perhaps, to be struck. And we were talking about how it is that in small villages, where people all know one another, how it is one gets a sense of community such that we do look after one another. And obviously that sort of community side is one of the things that we try to develop in other circumstances as well, colleges and universities, for example. So,
yes, that's right. a small village which is sort of stable, where the same people live in the same village for a long time, it's pretty likely that anybody you meet will be kin, will be a cousin. And so you might say, well, the brain could have built into it a kind of rule of thumb by natural selection, which says, be nice to everyone. Well, be nice to everyone, because everyone is a member of the same village, which means they're kin. But on the other hand, as Nick's just pointed out, everyone is also your closest competitor, because you're competing within the village. So it's not quite clear how to resolve that problem. I mean, when I'm asked why it is that humans show altruistic behavior, why humans go to give blood donors, why we give to charity, why we feel empathy for people who are suffering, and indeed for non-human animals who are suffering. And I usually say something like, well, in our ancestral past we lived in small villages, and you can't expect natural selection to build into brains a cognitive understanding of the theory of genetics and kin selection. What natural selection would build in would be a rule of thumb, which would be something like, be nice to everyone, because everyone is kin. But as we've just been talking about, everyone is also the closest competitor. So I think that's an unresolved paradox, I think, there, which I'd maybe just leave there, really.
No, I think that's entirely reasonable. It's a good dilemma for people to think through. I mean, I think the one other thing that we know exists in some vampire bat colonies is that individuals, sometimes if a vampire bat hasn't had a good meal, it'll beg for a gift of blood from one of the other ones hanging from the cave roof. And vampire bats are capable of recognizing one another as individuals. And if you beg for blood from me and I give it to you, but then a few days later I beg for blood from you and you pay no attention to my hopes, then next time you ask me, I won't give it to you. So there's an individuation and a sort of recognition component which perhaps can, at a slightly different level, account for part of the reason why groups that know one another look out for one another, because it might be you next time.
Yes. Well, we're now talking about reciprocation rather than kin, but it's the same principle, and you could make the same argument about reciprocation. And the bat blood donor scheme, which is, I think you're referring to the work of Williamson.
Yes.
Yes, that's quite right. They do recognize each other as individuals, and Williamson showed this very cleverly, experimentally. Yes, and reciprocation is another very important principle of the evolution of altruism. And again, you could apply this to the small village case. A small village not only consists of your cousins, it also consists of people you're going to meet again and again and again throughout your life. And therefore you have every opportunity to reciprocate, to pay back favors or deny favors, and to learn who is good for a favor, who is good for a bargain, and who's a cheat. And yes, so that's a nice example.
So we've talked a bit then about the social groups. I wonder if we could then think a little bit more going back to convergence.
Yes.
And one of the paradigm examples, I would think, of convergent evolution is the development of the eye.
Eyes have evolved many times independently in the animal kingdom. One estimates put it at more than 40 times independently has the eye evolved. Different kinds of eyes, compound eyes, reflector eyes, camera eyes. We have camera eyes. And so we have a lens which projects an upside-down image on a retina. And so do lots of other animals, and most notably cephalopod mollusks, things like octopuses and squids. And this is convergent evolution on a grand scale. The similarity between an octopus eye and a fish eye or a human eye is very considerable, it's very great. In both cases you have a lens, in both cases you have a retina, project the upside image on the retina. The retina consists of a great bank of light-sensitive cells which project onto the brain. Interestingly, the vertebrate retina, the light-sensitive cells point the wrong way. They point backwards, which seems to be bad design. And the wires that connect the light-sensitive cells to the brain have to travel over the surface of the retina, and then they dive through the retina in the blind spot into the optic nerve. In octopuses, the retina is the right way round. So it's a nice little illustration of the fact, although it's convergent, although it's very, very similar, you've got this crucial difference, which, as it were, gives the game away that it's independently evolved, quite independently evolved. Yes, so it's a very spectacular example of convergent evolution. There are many others, things like electric fish, which have independently evolved. Electric fish which find their way around by electric fields in muddy water. And they've independently evolved in South America and in Africa, quite independently. And again, a single revealing difference. In order to use electrolocation, it's necessary that the fish's body should be absolutely rigid. If it's swimming around like that, then that completely distorts the electric field, and so they can't use. They have to keep their body rigid. So what they do is they have a single fin, which runs right the way along either the back or the belly, and in one of them it's the back, and the other one it's the belly, and that's the thing that does the swimming. And the body itself remains absolutely rigid. And it's, again, this revealing difference that one of them, I forget which it is, whether it's the African one or the American one, that has the single fin on the belly, and the other one has the single fin on the back. So they've independently converged on the same solution, and it's uncannily similar. The Australian mammal fauna, a whole range of mammals in Australia, which are all marsupials, have independently evolved the same ways of life as mammals that we're more familiar with. So you have marsupial moles, marsupial mice, marsupial flying squirrels, marsupial rabbits, etc., marsupial dogs, marsupial cats. There's one major difference, which is the equivalent of marsupial antelopes, the browsing, grazing herbivores are kangaroos, and so they're very different because they hit upon this idea of using the hind legs and hopping on the hind legs. So that's a case where they don't converge, but in most other cases, they converge.
And I wonder if there's anything one can, another aspect that sort of looks like convergent evolution, I don't know whether it's correct to think of it that way, would be mimicry.
Yes.
And clearly there's another trade-off there as well, because if you are a harmless and delicious insect mimicking a vile-tempered and offensive insect, you can only be successful up to a certain point, because if there are enough of you, then whoever eats you will take its chances.
That's right, yes.
Any thoughts on
yes,
how
well,
that...
I think you're right to say it's like convergence. When a harmless butterfly mimics a poisonous butterfly, and there are many cases of this, there are lots of poisonous butterflies which have bright-coloured wings to advertise the fact that they are poisonous, and birds avoid them because they learn that these butterflies are poisonous. And then there are a whole lot of other species of butterfly which mimic them, which develop almost identical patterns to gain protection from the fact that the birds that have learned to avoid the poisonous ones mistake the mimics for the poisonous ones. But as Nick's just said, if the mimics become too numerous, then the birds will start to learn that actually this pattern tastes rather good. And so there has to be a balance. And one of the things that happens, rather interestingly, is that some species of mimicking butterfly have what's called a polymorphism, where they split into two or even three different patterns. Some of them mimic this distasteful butterfly, some of them mimic this distasteful butterfly, some of them mimic that distasteful butterfly, so that they don't outnumber the distasteful ones, which would, as you point out, destroy. And so one of the solutions is that they actually produce this polymorphism where they mimic different species. And this raises big problems for genetics, because how do they... It's all very well mimicking this species and not that one, but what if the spot pattern mimics this species and the stripy pattern mimics that species? You've got to get the whole thing right, and that's a difficult genetic problem. And it's known how it's solved, by the way, but...
And then I guess the last area of thought I have arising from the two things we've heard so far would be, we've been kind of talking about the gene and the vehicle, if you like, in which it is carried. What about the concept of extended phenotypes?
Oh, right.
Where does that take us?
Okay. My second book is called The Extended Phenotype, and I perhaps take a bit of time to explain that.
I think you should.
Okay. The phenotype is the normally considered to be the parts of the body which the genes are using, which the genes cause to have the shape that they do. So the pattern on the wings of a butterfly would be part of the phenotype, and the shape of the tail, the shape of the antennae, and so on is part of the phenotype. Well, from my point of view, the phenotype is a tool or set of tools by which the genes lever themselves into the next generation. I talked about a survival machine at the beginning. So the body is a whole set of phenotypes which are part of the gene's equipment to lever itself into the next generation, different genes using different parts of the body, different phenotypes. But if you think about it, something like a bird's nest, it's beautifully shaped, it's beautifully adapted, it's beautifully constructed to serve its purpose of keeping eggs safe and chicks safe and warm. It's obviously designed by natural selection. It's obviously evolved by natural selection. And that means that there has to have been genetic variation in the shape of the nest. Otherwise, it couldn't have evolved. So there must have been genes for big nests and small nests and round nests and shallow nests and deep nests and weaver bird nests with great tubes that keep the snakes out. So all the different shapes of bird's nest must have evolved by the same kind of evolution as the shapes of the body. And I call that extended phenotype. It's clearly phenotype, it's clearly caused by genes, influenced by genes, evolved by genetic selection. There must be genetic variation in the shape of nests. Bowerbirds in Australia and New Guinea, the male bird builds a bower, a beautiful structure, often made of grass, a lovely shape, decorated with red berries or blueberries or blue beer bottle tops, anything they can find to make it look attractive, and the females are attracted to the bower. So the male, instead of being like a peacock, which has its decoration on its own body, its phenotype itself, this is an extended phenotype in the bowerbird case. It's safer because the peacock is obviously highly conspicuous, not only to females, but to predators. The bowerbird exports its finery from its own body, from its own tail, to the bower, which it is not part of its body, so it doesn't get eaten by the predator that is attracted to the bower. So once again, you can think of the bower as an extended phenotype. A beaver dam is an extended phenotype built by beavers and for their own purposes, which are to make a lake which is good for fishing in and good for transporting logs through and things like that. So animal artifacts, of which of course there are many, can be thought of as part of the phenotype of the genes of the animal, but it's extended phenotype. Well, that's an inanimate artifact like a beaver dam or a bird nest. But what about parasites which live inside the host and influence the body and behavior of the host to their own advantage? There are many parasites who have a definitive host, which might be a sheep, a liver fluke. A fluke is a worm, a flatworm, which needs to get into a sheep. And it does so via an intermediate host, which might be a snail, or it might be an ant. This is called the intermediate host. And the parasite, when it's in the intermediate host, needs to influence the behavior of the intermediate host so as to make it more likely to get into the definitive host, which is the sheep. In the case of a fluke which gets into ant bodies, what it does is it crawls into it's a very, very tiny worm now, it crawls into the head of the ant and makes a tiny lesion in the brain of the ant, which causes the ant to change its behavior and to climb to the top of grass stems instead of going down into the ground. So that means that the ant is sitting at the top of a grass stem, vulnerable to being eaten by sheep, which is exactly what the worm wants. And so the worm gets into the sheep. Well, the change in behavior of the ant is extended phenotype of genes in the fluke, in the worm. It's clearly a Darwinian adaptation. That must mean that natural selection has worked on fluke genes, but the phenotype that is being influenced is the behavior of the ant. So those cases, and there are many, and they're very bizarre and rather sinister, those cases where a parasite influences the behavior of an intermediate host to get itself eaten by the definitive host, by the eventual host, these are all proper examples of extended phenotypes. Well, those are parasites that live inside their host. But what about cuckoos, which are parasites that don't live inside the host, but live in the host nest, and the host feeds them? So you know that cuckoos lay their eggs in the nest of another species, and then they disappear, and the other species is fooled into rearing them. And there are all sorts of complicated, detailed adaptations like egg mimicry, which is fascinating, probably no time to go into. But then when the cuckoo nestling grows up, becomes a fledgling and becomes a bit bigger, it can be 10 times as big as the host, as the foster parent, and the foster parent goes on feeding it, which is crazy. But that's because we see it through human eyes, and we say, well, how can this little wren feeding a gigantic cuckoo, how can it be so stupid? Well, it's not being stupid, it's just that its brain is being manipulated by something about the cuckoo, something about maybe the cuckoo has a supernormal gait, which it does. There's a Japanese cuckoo which has not only a great big gape, a yellow gape, which is waiting to have worms dropped into it, but it has a false gape on each shoulder. So it has 3 gapes. And that supernormal stimulus which attracts the foster parent, which might be a kind of robin. And so these cuckoos are experts in manipulating the behavior of their foster parents. The change in behavior of the foster parent is extended phenotype of the genes in the cuckoo, because the cuckoo must have been selected to do this manipulation. And that means that genes in cuckoos have been favored by natural selection. And that means that the phenotype that's been selected is actually the behavior of the host. Well, now we've got extended phenotype reaching from parasite to host, whether the parasite is not inside the host. Well, let's go one step further and talk about action at a distance, where you can have, say, a male singing and influencing the behavior, not just the behavior of a female, actually influencing the ovaries of a female. This has been shown in canaries and in doves. When a dove sings, it does a thing called a bow coo, which is it bows and it does a sort of cooing noise. Canaries sing, of course, as you know. In both cases, it's been experimentally shown that the effect of the song and the behavior, the courtship behavior, is to cause the female ovaries to massively swell. And this changes the whole behavior of the female, which is to the male's advantage. You could say the male is manipulating the female. The male, you might say, would like to be able to inject hormones into the female if he had a syringe and could do it, but he can't do that. But the next best thing, it's very effective, is to sing. And that has exactly the same effect. It causes the female's ovaries to swell. The poet Keats, in his Ode to a Nightingale, compared the effect of the nightingale on him to a drug. He said, "My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and Lethe woods had sunk." So Keats was actually drugged by the song of a nightingale. Well, Keats had a vertebrate nervous system like a female nightingale. What could manipulate the brain of Keats could manipulate the behavior of a female nightingale much more effectively. And I think that's what's going on. This is the change in the, I'm guessing the ovaries of the female nightingale swell just like those of a canary. Changes in the female bird, in its behavior, in its gonads, in its hormones, is extended phenotypic effect of genes in the male, because it's genes that are being selected in the male for their capacity, for their effectiveness in manipulating the behavior, not by injecting hormones, but by singing and having the same effect. And so I picture the whole dawn chorus is a network of extended phenotypic influence throughout the wood where the song is being percolated throughout. So, okay, that's my little lecturette on the extended phenotype.
That's Richard's second book.
Yes.
In the sort of the 10-minute
yes.
extended phenotype. Fantastic. One of the problems, of course, in charting these changes is that they take a very long time. That it's a very long process to get from being whatever a cuckoo started off as to being a bird that knows which nests to parasitize, is good at counting how many eggs have already been laid there, can throw the other eggs and nestlings out, can induce the parents to feed it, and then, when an adult, can fly off to Africa on its own and meet another bird of a species it's never seen in its life, recognize it as a cuckoo, mate, and come back and do the same thing all over again. It takes practice, as they say, or a long time. So the next reading we have is really moving from genetics as such into, I think, time and space. And it's from Unweaving the Rainbow.
Lalla was going to read it.
So, Lalla, thank you.
On a moonless night, when the stars look very cold about the sky, and the only clouds to be seen are the glowing smudges of the Milky Way, go out to a place far from street light pollution, lie on the grass, and gaze out at the sky. Superficially, you notice constellations, but a constellation's pattern means no more than a patch of damp on the bathroom ceiling. Note accordingly how little it means to say something like, Neptune moves into Aquarius. Aquarius is a miscellaneous set of stars, all at different distances from us, unconnected with each other, except that they constitute a meaningless pattern when seen from a certain, not particularly special, place in the galaxy. Here. A constellation is not an entity at all, not the kind of thing that Neptune or anything else can sensibly be said to move into. The shape of a constellation, moreover, is ephemeral. 1 million years ago, our Homo erectus ancestors gazed out nightly, no light pollution then, unless it came from the species' brilliant innovation, the campfire, at a set of very different constellations. 1 million years hence, our descendants will see yet other shapes in the sky, and we already know exactly how these will look. This is the sort of detailed prediction that astronomers but not astrologers, can make. And again, by contrast with astrological predictions, it will be correct. Because of light's finite speed, when you look at the great galaxy in Andromeda, you are seeing it as it was 2.3 million years ago, and Australopithecus stalked the high veld. You are looking back in time. Shift your eyes a few degrees to the nearest bright star in the constellation of Andromeda, and you see Merak, but much more recently, as it was when Wall Street crashed. The sun, when you witness its color and shape, is only 8 minutes ago. But point a large telescope at the Sombrero galaxy, and you behold 1 trillion suns, as they were when your tailed ancestors peered shyly through the canopy, and India collided with Asia to raise the Himalayas. A collision on a larger scale between two galaxies in Stephan's quintet is shown to us at a time when on Earth dinosaurs were dawning and the trilobites fresh dead.
Takes me a minute to get my breath back. One of the things that comes from that, of course, is the enormous periods of time over which evolutionary processes have taken place. But in a more anthropocentric sense, it reminds me that we all came out of Africa. And we now know we've come out of Africa, or humans have come out of Africa on several occasions. And that is a bottleneck experience. So genetic variation amongst Western Europeans, is far less than the genetic variation in Africa. And I wonder if there's anything one can start to say about bottleneck species, some of us, but also some other species which we know to be bottleneck species. And in a way, I suppose, the importance of genetic diversity.
Yes, I have something personal to say about this, because when I was writing my biggest book, The Ancestor's Tale, my co-author, Yan Wong, did a beautiful analysis of my own genome, which demonstrated this bottleneck effect beautifully. It so happened that I had my genome, this was quite a long time ago now, I'd had my genome sequenced completely. Not many people had in those days. The reason was a rather strange one. I was doing a television program called Sex, Death, and the Meaning of Life. And as part of this program, they wanted to, indeed they did, sequence my genome, and then my genome was to be buried for 1,000 years. And then the conceit was on television, you know how television works, that somebody would dig it up and would make a clone of me. And so it would be my identical twin 1,000 years hence. And the idea of the television program was that I would then talk about various issues that arise, like would this clone be me? Well, of course, it wouldn't be, and we could demonstrate that by getting a couple of identical twins and getting them to talk to each other and realizing they're not the same person. I would be able to teach my young 1,000-year hence clone not to make the same mistakes in life as I made. You've got the same genes as me, but don't make the same mistakes I made. And all sorts of things like that, personal identity problems. Anyway, it never happened. The television program turned into something completely different. But by then they'd paid for my genome to be sequenced, and it was sequenced, and they gave me the disc. Yan Wong, my co-worker, my co-author of The Ancestor's Tale, then took my genome and did an analysis of it, a very clever analysis, which actually demonstrated that the population from which I came, which is Western European, went through a bottleneck 60,000 years ago. And he did it by taking, well, how can I explain this? I'm sure you know that you have within every one of your cells, except your gonads, every one of your cells, a complete set of your paternal chromosomes and a complete set of your maternal chromosomes. They're just swimming around like that, not meeting each other. They only meet each other when they come together to make sperms or eggs. But they're separate. You've got 23 maternal and 23 paternal chromosomes. And what Jan did was to compare them, looking at each gene from my father and my mother, comparing them, and then calculating how far back you have to go before you hit so-called coalescent point, which is the point at which they sprang from a common ancestor. And in some cases it could be quite recent, but he found that in most cases they converged 60,000 years ago. And that indicates that there was a population bottleneck 60,000 years ago, such that the population was so small that individuals had no choice but to mate with close relatives of each other. That's the implication of this analysis. He then compared it to a similar analysis on a Nigerian. By the way, note that this is a single individual he's doing this analysis, just my genome. It's not a population, just me. From my genome alone, from his co-author of this book, he was able to reason out that there was a bottleneck in my ancestral population 60,000 years ago. He then did the same thing for a single Nigerian and found that there was no such bottleneck. And that's just what Nick has said, that whereas Western Europeans passed through a bottleneck, presumably when they came out of Africa 60,000 years ago, in Africa, the people our ancestors were in Africa for much, much longer than that. As you know, we evolved in Africa for millions of years. And so there's much greater diversity, genetic diversity in Africa than there is in the rest of the world. I think that was the point you were trying to make. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that many of you in the audience will know about is that there's lots of concern, for example, in the kinds of grains that we grow, that they now come from a very, very, very small genetic pool. And as such, we could be really unlucky and a disease could wipe them all out. And so the interest in crossing back to some of the ancestral strains and bringing in a bit more diversity is a kind of an insurance policy. I think cheetahs would be the other obvious animal that I'm used to thinking of as having clearly gone through a tiny population at some point, and now cheetahs reproduce rather ineffectively in a way. It's hard to keep the numbers up. And I often wonder whether the different subspecies of cheetah would be sensibly crossed so as to give a little more genetic diversity into each of the subspecies. But then there are purists who think it would be a tragedy to dilute the subspecies. So there's a strange, I mean, I think it's better to have some cheetahs, even if they're sort of a bit of a mixture, than no cheetahs at all, knowing they would have been very pure if we still had them. But genetic variation, and of course we see it in lots of other things too. There are New World monkeys in which color vision, color detectors are different in, I think I'm right in saying, different subgroups of the males.
Yes, that's correct. I forget which, I think that's right. The females have 3 color vision like we do. So they have light-sensitive cells in their retinas which are sensitive to both red, green, and blue. And the males are polymorphic. Some of them, they all have blue. But some of them have red and some of them have green. So if you've got several males together, between them they can see all the colors, but any one can't. Isn't there some legend about bomber crews in the Second World War wanting to have a colorblind member because the colorblind person could see through camouflage.
Yes.
You know about the...
Yes, my father wasn't a bomber pilot in World War II, but worked with the Royal Air Force for a very long time afterwards. And certainly the Air Force claimed that it was very helpful to have a colorblind person because a lot of camouflage relies on color. And if you don't see the color, you can see the object.
Yeah.
My father himself told me he'd once gone for a walk in the desert in California with a colorblind friend who kept pointing out, carefully camouflaged Gila monsters and the like, which my father could see when they were pointed out to him, but which for someone with normal color vision were almost completely cryptic. But for someone with, who just saw it all in black and white, it seemed to be simple. So some quite curious effects from these aspects of
I would guess from
genetic
that
variation.
that these animals were aimed at
Birds.
avoiding birds, not mammals, because most mammals are actually colorblind or red-green colorblind, I think. And so yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So one other thought that comes out of this piece, and just perhaps we could briefly touch on it. I mean, the comment about astrology and astronomy, I think, might one make a general statement that all modern science, almost all, will have had precursors in which people were looking at the same things and thinking about them fairly differently. But in some cases, like astrology, mostly people think, well, probably astronomy gets it right. I mean, people may enjoy trusting astrology, but I don't think they say the astrologers are definitely seeing things and predicting things that the astronomers can't. But maybe I'm wrong. In chemistry, the alchemists certainly just gave up. Alchemy became chemistry, or maybe abstruse forms of physics. I think there's an interesting point about how the precursors of science either hang on and put themselves up as an alternative or become absorbed into the current scientific corpus.
Yes,
I don't know if you... I know you were in New Zealand.
Yes,
and
I
you
was.
had a series of discussions
Right.
about this.
I've just come from New Zealand a couple of days ago, and I got into a bit of a row in New Zealand because there's official government policy in New Zealand is to incorporate Maori, Polynesian, so-called ways of knowing. It's called Mataranga Maori. Maori ways of knowing into science education classes, alongside science and with equal status with science. And I feel this is nonsense, and several New Zealand scientists do as well. And I feel that Maori mythology, indeed mythologies all over the world, are of great cultural value, great cultural interest, great historic interest, but they're not science. And in New Zealand, seven academics, many of them fellows of the New Zealand Royal Society, wrote a letter to a magazine in New Zealand called The Listener, complaining about this, deploring this education policy of the government of Jacinda Ardern, which was dreamed up, by the way, by Chris Hipkins when he was Minister of Education. He's now the Prime Minister. Dreamed up by his education department. And they became ostracized, and they were investigated. They were threatened with investigation by the New Zealand Royal Society because they were accused of cultural insensitivity, maybe even racism, for not supporting the government policy of teaching Maori ways of knowing, which include vitalism, which include creation myths by the Earth Mother and the Sky Father and whatever, the Maori equivalent of the Book of Genesis, Adam and Eve and so on. Vitalism, the belief that everything has a spirit and is driven by the spirit, which is very foreign to science. They refer to science as Western science, which I think is an insult to Chinese and Japanese and Indian science. They refer to it as Western science, as though buying into the sort of cultural relativism belief that science is just the tribal myth of one particular tribe of humans, namely white Western Europeans. And of course, that's not what science is about. Science is humanity. It belongs to all of humanity. It belongs to the... It's humanity's best shot at finding the truth. Science has methods in place for avoiding self-deception. Things like, in medical research, the double-blind trial, where medical researchers who are investigating, for example, the efficacy of a new drug, a new medicine, they will have some pills which are the actual medicine itself, and some which are control, which don't contain it. And they'll have, say, 100 patients or 1,000 patients, and they'll give half the patients the drug and the other half the patients the control. And the point about the double-blind trial is that neither the doctors nor the patient nor the nurses nor anybody involved knows which patient has received the drug and which patient has received the control. It's all concealed in a computer, and it's not unmasked until the experiment is ended. Well, that is a wonderful guard against self-deception, because all scientists are human, and they are vulnerable to wanting their own pet theory to come out right. If they're pushing a new drug, they want it to succeed. But the double-blind trial protects against self-deception. You cannot cheat. Science is filled with devices for preventing cheating, not just the double-blind trial. Peer review, repeating experiments, and if the experiment can't be repeated, then it's not taken seriously. So science really isn't some kind of tribal myth. Science is unique. Science is an entirely separate enterprise which belongs to the whole of humanity, and of which the whole of humanity can be proud. So I said all this in Auckland and Wellington, and actually was enthusiastically received by the audience. I got heckled by one person in Wellington, and she was invited to participate in the discussion, politely invited, but she chose to walk out instead. And I then wrote an article in The Spectator, which is a London journal, a British magazine. It's in this week's Spectator if you want to look it up, describing my whole experience. And I think the general lesson is that so-called indigenous ways of knowing, which are different all over the world, different in every part of the world. You have indigenous myths, which are of great poetic value in many cases and great historic interest. But they're all different from each other. They can't all be right. Science can be right because it's different. Science has its own methods which are unique and worldwide and universal. Science is true all over scientific truths are true all over the universe. Physics is true all over the universe. If Maori physics were true, it would have to be true all over the universe, which would mean that they shouldn't just be taught in New Zealand, but should be taught everywhere. And of course, that's not what's being asked for at all. The idea is that there's something special about, because the Maoris arrived in New Zealand before Europeans did, that somehow their wisdom, their ancestral wisdom, should be taken seriously, respected, and actually taught in science classes. And that's what we objected to.
I wonder if we could read a piece about education. It seems the moment.
Yes.
Perhaps you and Lalla both.
That's right. Lalla and I will do a double act on this one. This is about the headmaster of my old school, which was Oundle in Britain. It's a boarding school, and it had a great headmaster in the late 19th century. He died in 1922, giving a lecture. He dropped dead in the middle of giving a lecture. And he was a great innovator in education. He took the view that it was only boys in those days. The school now takes girls. He took the view that every boy had something valuable in him and it had to be found and developed. And so he was passionately against rote learning and cramming facts. He wanted boys to be innovative and to learn on their own. So Lalla and I are going to read an essay that I wrote. I was actually invited by the Oundle School to give the first inaugural so-called Oundle lecture, and I chose to lecture about this great headmaster, Frederick William Sanderson, who, as I say, died in 1922, just over 100 years ago now. Sanderson's passionate desire to give boys the freedom to fulfill themselves would have thrown health and safety into a hissy fit and set today's lawyers licking their chops with anticipation. He directed that the laboratories should be left unlocked at all times so that boys could go in and work at their own research projects, even if unsupervised. The more dangerous chemicals were locked up. Quote, but enough was left about to disturb the equanimity of other masters who had less faith than the head in that providence which looks after the young, end of quote. The same open-door policy applied to the school workshops, the finest in the country, filled with advanced machine tools which were Sanderson's pride and joy. Under these conditions, one boy damaged a surface plate by using it as an anvil against which to hammer a rivet. The culprit tells the story in the book Sanderson of Oundle.
That did disconcert the head for a little when it was discovered. As well it might, for a surface plate is a precisely machined plane surface used for judging the flatness of objects. But my punishment was quite Oundelian. I had to make a study of the manufacture and use of surface plates and bring a report and explain it all to him. And after that, I found I had learnt to look twice at a fine piece of work before I used it ill.
Incidents like this led eventually, and not surprisingly, to the workshops and laboratories again being locked when there was no adult supervision. But some boys felt the deprivation keenly, and in true Sandersonian fashion, they set out in the workshops and the library, another of Sanderson's personal prides, to make an intensive study of locks.
In our enthusiasm, we made skeleton keys for all Oundle, not only for the laboratories, but for private rooms as well. For weeks, we used the laboratories and workshops as we'd grown accustomed to use them, but now, with a keen care of the expensive apparatus and with precautions to leave nothing disorderly to betray our visits. It seemed that the head saw nothing. He had a great gift for assuming blindness until speech day came round, and then we were amazed to hear him as he beamed upon the assembled parents, telling them the whole business. And what do you think my boys have been doing now?
Sanderson's hatred of any locked door which might stand between a boy and some worthwhile enthusiasm symbolized his whole attitude to education. A certain boy was so keen on a project he was working on that he used to steal out of the dormitory at 2 a.m. to read in the, unlocked of course, library. The headmaster caught him there and roared his terrible wrath for this breach of discipline. He had a famous temper, and one of his maxims was, "Never punish except in anger." Again, the boy himself tells the story.
The thunderstorm passed. "And what are you reading, my boy, at this hour?" I told him of the work that had taken possession of me, work for which the daytime was all too full. Yes, he understood that. He looked over the notes I'd been taking, and they set his mind going. He sat down beside me to read them. They dealt with the development of metallurgical processes, and he began to talk to me of discovery and the values of discovery, the incessant reaching out towards knowledge and power, the significance of this desire to know and make, and what we in the school were doing in that process. He talked for nearly an hour in that still nocturnal room. It was one of the greatest, most formative hours in my life. Go back to bed, my boy. We must find some time for you in the day for this.
I don't know about you, but that story brings me close to tears.
I'm going to leave you all to think about that for yourselves. I'm going to ask Lalla actually to get up again, I think, and read one last piece, which I think is, I would say, a perspective piece.
This is from Unweaving the Rainbow again. Fling your arms wide in an expansive gesture to span all of evolution from its origin at your left fingertip to today at your right fingertip. All the way across your midline to well past your right shoulder, life consists of nothing but bacteria. Many-celled invertebrate life flowers somewhere around your right elbow. The dinosaurs originate in the middle of your right palm and go extinct around your last finger joint. The whole story of Homo sapiens and our predecessor, Homo erectus, is contained in the thickness of one nail clipping. As for recorded history, as for the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Jewish patriarchs, the dynasties of pharaohs, the legions of Rome, the Han emperors, the Christian fathers, the laws of the Medes and Persians which never change. As for Troy and the Greeks, Helen and Achilles and Agamemnon dead. As for Napoleon and Hitler, the Beatles and Vladimir Putin, they and everyone that knew them are blown away in the dust from one light stroke of a nail file.
I said that Richard writes science with beautiful prose, but he also writes poetry without poetic license. Richard, thank you very, very much. Lalla, thank you. And to the audience, thank you.